64K. Where the future is so bright you gotta wear shades.
Hey, Bastish B here for 64K and welcome to another episode of One Man and His Machine. And today's profile is on Chris Butler, a very talented 80s Commodore 64 programmer. This was his machine of choice. Let's check out the early years. Chris Butler is a UK video game programmer most fondly remembered for his arcade conversions to the Commodore 64, but there's a lot more to the story than that. So let's jump back to 1983, where Chris had one of his first games published by SoftSpot, a small UK software company. The game in question was called Transistor's Revenge for the BBC Micro. He released a few other small titles through them, but Chris realized pretty quickly that the BBC Micro was not the future, at least for a hungry programmer trying to make a living. It was around 1984 that Chris watched an expose on British software house Imagine Software and the money and lifestyles the programmers were enjoying in the wake of Imagine's massive success. Despite the company's implosion, Ocean now owned the name, and Chris decided to apply to an advert the company published looking for new programmers. Here's what Chris had to say about the encounter. "What kind of salary are you going to offer me?" And they said $5,000. I could get more by working in a bank in Southend. And so ended his brief encounter with Imagine. Chris eventually settled at the small UK software house Alligator in early 1984. Alligator had only been around since '83 at that point, but had built up a solid amount of decent titles in a short amount of time on all the major 8-bit computer systems at the time, like the BBC Micro, Spectrum, C64 and Amstrad. They are probably best remembered for programmer Anthony Crowther's early games such as Blagger and Loco. Chris had a lot of programming experience with the BBC Micro, but it was decided he would move on to the C64 as it was selling like hotcakes and Alligator wanted a piece of the cake. Chris found the transition to programming on it fairly easy as both machines shared a similar architecture for programming. 4 months later, Chris's first game for Alligator was released on the C64 called Hyper Circuit, and it was based on one of his earlier BBC games, Transistor's Revenge. Chris's second game for them took him 5 months to complete and was released at the beginning of 1985. It was called Zed, a really fast-paced shoot-'em-up that showed off his programming talents with fast and frantic scrolling gameplay and sprite overloads. People started to take notice. At this point, after 2 relatively successful games, Alligator just simply couldn't afford to keep Chris around anymore, and he was off to find a new publisher to work with. He shopped around at a few companies like Ocean and Activision, but ended up settling at Elite, who gave him the best deal. It was late 1985 at this point, and Elite had just acquired the license to Commando based on the Capcom arcade game. Unfortunately, Elite wanted the game to ship for Christmas, and that gave Chris 8 weeks to make the game from start to finish, which was a mammoth undertaking. But he did it, and he delivered the C64 version on time, and according to Chris, one of his levels was completely removed from the game once Rob Hubbard was on board for the music. Rob needed 6K for the Commando theme, so the Elite higher-ups decided to axe level 4 from the game, hence Commando's 3 levels. Everything worked out perfectly though in the end. The game was number 1 in the charts for December 1985, and the Rob Hubbard scores become a bona fide SID classic. Chris later said about it, "It made Christmas number 1, and made me a small fortune." 1986 rolled around, and Elite were so pleased with the Commando result that they gave him another Capcom license they got, Ghosts and Goblins. But this time he had 5 months to complete the game. When asked about doing arcade conversions, he said, "I'm quite happy doing arcade conversions. It's dead easy work." Ghosts and Goblins was another C64 smash hit, and Elite were over the moon with the results. Chris received many offers from other software houses after the success of Commando and Ghosts, but he decided to stick with Elite. For now, as they had just got a new license, and Chris couldn't resist the challenge of converting the Sega Arcade Space Harrier to the humble C64. The magazines and industry insiders thought the task was impossible to make it run on the machine. Chris proved them wrong. Space Harrier was released in 1987 and sold really well. The reviews at the time were really mixed, but in my opinion he did a bang-up job on the game. When asked if he would ever do an original game again after all these arcade conversions, he simply said, "The thing is that so much is involved in writing an original game. It's not just programming, there's actual game design as well. And game design is the one thing I'm not very good at. Next was another conversion of sorts of Battleships to the C64 based on the classic board game. The game was actually held back for a year after completion and was released on the Encore label, which was Elite's new budget line of games. The game was received really well and garnered rave reviews at the time. At this point, Chris decided to leave Elite and go freelance. When asked if he had ever want to write a movie license game, he responded, "I wouldn't really want to, no. But you know, unless it was purely for financial gain, then I would." It was plain to see that despite his incredible programming skills, making games was a job for him. Not so much a passion, but something he just knew how to do really well, as this quote proved. "I wouldn't write a game solely for the pleasure of writing a game. I'm a commercial software writer. Full stop. There's no doubt about it." And with that, Chris settled at the UK software developer US Gold and converted the Atari skateboarding arcade game to the C64, 720 Degrees. It was another well-received and commercially successful game, and that rounded out 1987. Next up was a Sega arcade game that US Gold had just licensed, and Chris wanted a shot at it. The game in question was Thunderblade, and another game like Space Harrier where the press sniggered at the thought of it being converted to the C64 successfully. Chris decided to take up the challenge, and the game was eventually released in 1989 to mixed reviews, but again sold really well. And when asked about his process for converting these giant arcade games, he simply said, "I always try to capture what it is about the subject matter that attracts the game player." And with that, it was time to move on. Software manager for US Gold at the time, Charles Cecil, decided to defect to Activision, and Chris decided to tail along for the ride. He was looking for his next big title, and he got it at Activision. They gave him 8 months to convert the behemoth Sega arcade racer Power Drift to the C64. This is what Chris had to say about the opportunity. "The license for Power Drift surfaced soon after. I wanted a big title to work on, and it was all that was available." 8 months later, Power Drift was complete and was released in early 1990 to rave reviews and much acclaim. Chris was at an all-time high, having many successful conversions back to back. His bravado and straightforwardness did sometimes get him into hot water with his fellow peers, as seen by his response about other programmers he admired. Archie McLean is a good programmer. Steve Evans is good. Braybrook, I'm not too sure about. His games look good, but I don't know. Crowther's a bit past it. Paul Wokes is good, but he's a bit of a black horse. He definitely spoke his mind, which maybe a lot of people didn't appreciate at the time. And so rolled on his next game for Activision, 1990's conversion of Ninja Spirit to the C64 based on the IREM arcade game. This was a much more straightforward conversion, but Chris threw everything at it, resulting in another top-notch conversion and a game that reviewed extremely well at the time. In that same year, UK software house System 3 released the game called Vendetta, which was a mixture of The Last Ninja and a racing game, but the driving sections in the game people really seemed to respond to. System 3 decided to expand the concept and turn those manic driving sections into a full game unto itself. After the massive success of Power Drift, they felt Chris was the man for the job. He joined up with them, and the result was 1991's sublime racing destruction game, Turbocharge, which seemed to use all Chris's 3D speed and racing programming techniques he had mastered over the years and put it into a single game. It was another big hit and garnered rave reviews across the board in all the C64 magazines at the time. When asked how long the C64 had at this point, he said, "There is a good few years of C64 games to come. Yes, 16-bit is interesting, but there's life in this old dog yet." Chris's final game for the C64 came 1 year later in 1992 for Zeppelin Games called Arnie, which was an isometric styled run and gun game in the same mold as Commando. It was a great little game that again garnered great reviews, but it was kind of a strange end to his C64 legacy, going out on an original game and a budget one as well. After this, information is pretty vague on Chris's career, but we'll look at the last known credits of his work that ends in 2001. In 1993 and 94, Chris was the lead programmer in two pretty well received System 3 Super Nintendo games, namely Putty and Putty Squad. Then there's a bit of a gap on his resume until 1998 when he's credited on Crime Killers, a pretty decent 3D racing destruction game on PC and PS1. I used to have this and played it quite a lot. It was pretty enjoyable. This was followed by 1998's GT Interactive release of War of the Worlds, and followed lastly by his swan song, The Italian Job, in 2001 on the PS1 and PC again. And maybe Chris finally got his financial reward for doing a movie license game after all. And I'll finish this off with a quote by Chris when asked if being a programmer has all been worth it. He said, "Undoubtedly. I still love writing games. It's a boy's dream after all. And me, straight out of school, a dream career, even if I'm not incredibly wealthy." So you're probably wondering, whatever happened to Chris Butler after the 2000s? Well, that's a pretty hard question to answer. He has remained extremely elusive, just like another C64 programmer, Stavros Vasalis. Okay, I was able to find a few credits for Chris Butler after 2000. There's a game called Railworks that came out in 2009. He's credited as working on that. It's one of those railroad simulator games. And 2012, Need for Speed Most Wanted has his name in the credit. Now, whether this is the original Chris Butler from back in the 80s or whether it's just somebody else with the same name, Chris Butler is not exactly an uncommon name. You're not talking about something weird. So I'm not 100% sure whether this is the Chris Butler. I'll be interested to know if anybody has any other information. Please leave it in the comments or let us know what he's been up to in the last 10 years, especially because it's just trail runs cold. Actually, it runs cold in 2000. These are just two things that I just managed to find. It's not really confirmed. There's no interviews, there's no nothing. So whether he just retired or went into like the Fallout shelter with Stavros Vasalis and they're both working on some sort of magical C64 game that's coming out next year. So obviously the sources of information were few and far between, like I've mentioned many times. I just want to acknowledge that there were two interviews from Zap64 magazines, one from 1985 and one from 1989, that were extremely useful. I gleaned a lot of information from that and also from a few other little sources across the internet. Information about him is sparse at best, but if you want a little bit more information about Chris, check out these two issues of Zap64. Both those have the interviews and are well worth reading. Okay, thanks for joining me, Bassish B at 64K. I hope you enjoyed that little profile. If you can like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.